schedule, I am so happy to introduce some of my favorite colleagues and friends. They need no introduction. Bobbie Osteen and Joe Walker, ACE. Come on down. So, I should have said something else before, but now they're coming. It's fine. We'll get there.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for being here, Joe. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, mine. All mine.
So I want to start off asking you, since you were trained as a classical composer, and you said that you had parallel careers as an editor and a composer. You said they were both musical. Could you elaborate on how they're similar and how it helped you as an editor to have been that?
It's never a good thing for a middle-aged man to dwell on their childhood publicly, but I will for a moment. Or talk about their mothers. It's just not a good look. But I would say, when I was 8, my parents were given a 8mm regular 8 camera, and it was a home movie camera, and we had a little projector. And so I just did all these little experiments because I was bored during the summer, and I would play Keystone Cops films that I'd bought with my paper round money, and I'd play them really slowly, and I'd play my dad's Wagner LPs also very slowly and kind of get depressed, when you're 8, that kind of long summer depression. And that was just... So it's been a lifetime of trying to figure out whether it's the LPs that turn me on or the slow motion 8mm. I can't really tell. It's hard to divide them. But I think there are parallels between, certainly in terms of software, it's, composing for me was pushing a mouse around, as is editing. But also I tend to think in terms of tempo and pace and, what's foreground, what's background. What's decoration, what's substance, and the feeling of moving through time is an important thing in both music and film. So I don't know, there's more that's united, I think, than dissimilar.
And what's also interesting in your journey to becoming an editor is that you had this amazing apprenticeship at BBC because you did everything. I mean, you started out at the beginning, but as an apprentice and an editor and a dubbing editor, and you worked on children's programs and police procedurals. But your goal, which I thought was so interesting, was, and you said you could vary your diet. There's a lot of quotes I'm going to give you from Joe. He has amazing quotes. But I wanted to, right off the bat, have you tell the story about your mentor. And he gave you an opportunity to edit a sequence and the lesson you learned.
Well, I mean, I owe an awful... We all owe something to a mentor. At some point, somebody's recognized our, nation skills. And I had this marvelous editor, Arden. So we were working on film. At the BBC, most of the drama was shot on Super 16. And... you were just an editor and an assistant, and then you would assist. I'd do the dailies, and I'd do the rubber numbering, and I'd do the logging. And then quite often you had the rest of the afternoon with nothing to do. And one advantage was that Arden did like a drink at lunchtime. So he would often disappear for a little while behind the trim bin, and... And basically, somebody had to cut the fucking movie. I mean, that's the bottom line. So I got this, he would let me try things out, and it was the first person who actually, you can talk till you're blue in the face about editing, you can read every book, and you can study every manual, but, you really have to get your hands dirty at some point and forget about being an assistant and try and behave like a professional editor. And in the case of this, we were working on it was a drama comedy set in Wales, and there was a scene I'd been given, And it was an argument between three old men in a pub, and it was three brilliant actors, and the dialogue, which is written by Andrew Davies, a very famous screenwriter in the UK. It was very funny, very sharp. And the director had just shot it in a wide shot, and he'd shot singles, and I think there was one cutaway of either a glass of wine being put on the table or a cigarette being stubbed out. I can't remember. Anyway, so Arden had his customary relaxation period after lunchtime, and I got to it, and I worked tirelessly trying to kind of make every line have a reaction and try to kind of squeeze every little beat, and I was taking bits from every take, and I was championing little moments, and I was being super diligent, and I was basically a pool of sweat on the floor after a couple of hours of trying to put the scene together. And Arden rose, and he said, "Look, put it up, let's have a look." And he had a look at it, and I'd used the wide shot just at the beginning to establish where everybody was, and then I got stuck into the close-ups, right? I mean, typical BBC, time-honored way of covering a scene. And he just looked at it and he said, yes, not bad. He said, "Just show me the wide shot." And we looked at the wide shot, and the wide shot had everything that I'd been shoehorning in, trying too hard, way too hard to try and shoehorn in. And it had actually more. It had the body language. It had all of the lines and all of the laughs and all of the reactions, but somehow it had this group of men and this feeling of it all just happening. It felt like nobody was leading your hand. Nobody was forcing you to laugh or register a look. It was all there and played out in the wide shot. And he said, "Well, it's better."
And he said, just because they shot it doesn't mean you need to use it, which is such a good lesson. And you, in your career, you have totally followed through on that in a beautiful way, Joe. You always trust your audience. You always allow the performances to breathe. You're a very ballsy editor, really, because you let these shots play out for longer than a lot of editors would have the courage to incredible results very often. You trust your audience and you trust the performances, and I really admire you tremendously for that. And clearly that this was a great lesson for you. I mean, you said also these were three great actors and they had great comic timing, and then you mess with it and it's not, it's so interesting,
It's easier now as well. You can have a bin, and you can do your version with the close-ups, and you can do your version without the close-ups. I mean, often it's a difficult thing with a director to manage. How, when you've got something slightly radical, which is basically saying, I know that you did the wide shot between 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., and then you shot close-ups and cutaways until 6 o'clock p.m. But I only used the first 10 minutes of your day, and all of that time was wasted. That's kind of a hard thing to do. So, I just do multiple versions, and sometimes I have to convince myself that I've done the right thing and I'm not being perverse, or, I'm learning as I get older to be, in a way, more generous. I think filmmaking takes a lot of generosity. It takes generosity from the actors to time after time give you that look that you need to be in the moment, to sit in a hot car with the cameras pointed at them for 6 hours, but always to be in the moment when they turn over. It's generosity, and I think in editing, I feel like I have to be generous and think of multiple ways of telling a scene rather than just one.
But I also want you to talk about landscaping, because this is something that I've never heard as a word used to describe a strategy of editing, and we really see it in the clips. So can you talk about what you mean by landscaping?
I think what you're referring to is, it's the idea of manipulating pace to give these standalone islands of a shot, that is going to endure. To give it its best shot at doing that, you need to build up to it and come away from it and use pace to your advantage. That's what I mean by landscaping. It's that, you don't want multiple events, you want one big event. And
you do have very extended shots sometimes, and then very bold cuts, and which have much more impact because of what preceded it. But the way you compress time before and after those extended takes, which makes it all work, because you have to be commercial, you have to be aware of the pace for an audience, but you also have to, I love when you said sometimes when you really show something for a long time, there's no safety net for the audience, which is wonderful, and that kind of thing can't happen unless you compress time before and after, because it wouldn't sustain itself.
Yeah, particularly with Steve McQueen's work, he's given me an opportunity because of the way that he shoots, sometimes to be incredibly bold in that way. And I think a lot of it is sort of, as editors, we got this imaginary audience in our head, and we're trying to figure out what the questions that we can stimulate, what are the questions that if we've stimulated them right, they'll be asking, and you're kind of playing a striptease with the audience to some degree. You're sort of trying to tantalize and withhold information, just show a little ankle. Arrival is showing an ankle to the ultimate degree, because you just don't show a little bit of puff of cloud and a bit of smoke and something moving. And then, bit by bit, you discover more about those creatures. So, I don't know, it's a kind of bit of a striptease act that you're doing, but you're constantly trying to kind of work out where the audience are. And it helps, I love in drama the opportunity to test an audience to a group of people like yourselves, and everybody turns up as if it's Sunday service. Their soul is available. You better not disappoint them. You turn the film and you hope your best that they're open. They're not open with their lovers as much as they are in the cinema, and you take advantage of that, and you monitor it, and then. I don't know, in Steve's case, there are two, in Widows, there's a big example of that, of feeding the pace a little bit before something where you're going to be stately and hold back. So you go into something almost where you're ahead of the audience, and then you're with the audience. So it's measuring constantly when you're with the audience and when you're ahead of them, and when, God forbid, you're behind. That's the worst thing.
And I love that you say time is your superpower.
I should get a T-shirt. We should
it's a
sell
good one
t-shirts.
for editors. And it's interesting too, because you said he was an avant-garde artist. He won the Turner Prize in England. You grew up in the same neighborhood, but you were attracted to the avant-garde, to the unconventional way of doing things. And he also shoots. You said he hates the word coverage. And he shoots one camera minimally, which is nice for you, because it's sort of, and this sort of, you said that he holds on things that a lot of directors would be uncomfortable holding on, and that's, but that you're the perfect match, the two of you, because then you took that and went with it. You know what I mean? So you both had the courage to do that together, and I think. Like, for example, the first film you did together, Hunger, which we're not going to show a clip from, but I just want to say that was interesting that you had the first third of the movie, which was very, can you talk about that? And then this dialogue scene
Hunger is an
forever.
it's an impossible film to take a clip from, because, once you start watching it, it's like 21 minutes later, there's a cut.
Yeah, but that's so interesting, though, that the first third, you had all this tension and action, then you had 21 minutes of a tennis match, as you say, dialogue scene. You couldn't, and the fact that you got away with that because of the balance and trusting, it's a courageous thing to do, but it worked.
That film is in 3 parts, and the first part is sort of deliberately starved of dialogue. I think there's only 2 stretches of dialogue in it. One, which is where a political prisoner is arriving and is reading the pro forma declaration, and the second one is a guard tells a bad joke.
Right.
I think, but one of them was improvised.
But that's so interesting. So you have this minimally verbal, and then suddenly you're going to tolerate that because of that, and
You're starved.
You're starved, right? And knowing your audience, and
what you see in the first third of the film is an escalation of tension and violence, and it ends up with an act of terrible violence. And then you're in the mood to discuss it. You really are in the mood to discuss it and dissect it. And then you're treated to this, the second part of the film, which is a conversation between a hunger striker, Bobbie Sands, and his priest. And it's covered in one shot. You really barely see them. They're in silhouette. The plumes of smoke from their cigarettes is the most dynamic thing in the shot. And you hold for, I think, 17 and a half minutes. And they rehearsed, the two actors rehearsed for a week. They holed up in a hotel room and learnt this dialogue. And it's like a Connors, it's like a Wimbledon tennis match, and with a sort of fast volleying. And so we hold on that. And then, but you really, it's a kind of avant-garde experience in a way, because you engage. I think what I've found with people is they watch it and they engage, and then when they realize it isn't going to cut, they kind of drift off, and then they reattach, some of them quicker than others, and then it becomes, the audience is sort of part of it. And what you've done is just put a border around something, and you're presenting a slice of reality to them with the least amount of manipulation. And people are, really reward that by the attention they give it. And then eventually we cut to a close-up, and that, I think, sustains for about 6 minutes. So there were other shots. They did a circular shot that tracked round. It was always Steve's plan to kind of try and play the scene as long as possible. They chose to shoot in a format that allowed them 20 minutes of a camera magazine. So it was designed that way, but we really held off cutting, and I loved doing that. That's a very strong. And then the third part of the movie is another thing, which is the death throes of somebody who's been on a hunger strike for a long time, and it becomes a very poetic and sort of inner landscape, some hallucinations, and it's the final passage of Michael Fassbender's character. So it's kind of in 3 very distinct parts.
And the film we're going to show, the first clip from, Shame, is the next film with Steve McQueen, with Michael Fassbender again, in his entirety, shall I say.
Well, it was one of the weirdest things was that the last shot of Hunger is Michael Fassbender's body just being covered by the sheet and being taken out on a hospital gurney. And then the very first shot of the dailies that I got on Shame was him waking up on a same-coloured bed. And it felt like reincarnation, it really.
He was more well-fed, though, in that one.
Yes.
Yes. So we're actually going to show clips out of order. This is the only time, but we're going to show the first clip is actually about I think it's an hour into the film. And do you want to set up the clip?
Which is this? Is this the Clear Out?
Clear Out.
This is a guy who's, somebody once really dismissively said about Shame, saying, "Oh, Michael Fassbender's overdosed at the sex buffet, boo-hoo." It's a horrible way to ridicule this film. But it is about a man who's coping with sexual addiction, and at some point, when things get too much, he decides to have a clear out, and he gets rid of his stash.
And he's also met someone, he's never been able to commit to someone that we see in the movie, and there's a possible love interest, so he feels the pressure and the shame from his sister, and a lot of things contribute. Just previous to this clip, there's also a shot where he's just sitting there. Again, this movie has a lot of, how would you describe the style of, there's a lot of long, extended...
Shame is probably one of my, it really is, I'd urge those of you that haven't seen it to seek it out. And to me, I'm incredibly nostalgic about it as a film. I felt like really happy with the editing of it, and really happy with the whole project and how I fitted into the whole project.
You're really inside him, and you're really feeling what he's going through, and you
it's all about sort of like the subtext. So much is unspoken in the relationship between him and his sister, and
you never even find out the exact, which is so nice to not spell everything out. Why do you have to spell everything out? You know there's a troubled history. They both have problems, but I like that. I like the mystery of that.
So quite late in the process, we came up with a line for her to leave on an answer phone message where she says, "We're not bad people, we just come from a terrible place." And it sort of summed up everything, and it felt like it would be really, for ages we were trying to work out what to put on the laptop. There's a moment where his sister, he's been on the laptop and he's been looking at, explicit material, and his sister comes back and finds him in the middle of it. And for the longest time it was a blue screen that we had to figure it out. In fact, the first job that Steve McQueen gave me was he sent me 10 gigabytes of pornography to work through. And me and my very, fearless assistant, Lisa, in London, we went about it like proper diligent editors. And, we had a chart. I just don't know how far to go with this. It's not a dinner party after all, but I will tell you that we worked out the difference is 90% of them had the same formula, but 1% of them, he went down on her, and that was the difference. But anyway, sorry, Bobbie. I know that we had ambitions for this talk, and I've trashed them, but let's show the clip.